The night air over Victorian England often carried the smell of coal smoke long before the sun had fully risen. In the narrow streets of London, and in the smaller towns scattered between damp fields and winding rivers, the darkness lingered quietly against rows of brick houses. Thin fog drifted along the roads. Window glass held faint reflections of weak candlelight. Somewhere in the distance, a horse pulled a cart slowly over wet stones, its wheels making a soft and uneven sound against the sleeping city. Inside many homes, children were already awake. Some sat silently near small fireplaces that struggled to warm the room. Others rubbed tired eyes while cold water waited in metal bowls beside the kitchen table. In wealthier homes, nursery maids moved carefully through dim hallways, carrying lamps that flickered against wallpaper decorated with faded flowers. In poorer homes, entire families still slept together beneath rough blankets, packed closely for warmth while the first sounds of labor drifted in from the street outside. Victorian childhood was not always loud or playful. It was often quiet. Quiet in ways that history slowly forgot. The children of that age lived inside routines that now feel very distant. Their days moved according to bells, smoke, weather, factory whistles, church clocks, and the constant need for work. Even very young children understood exhaustion. They understood long waiting. They understood silence during meals. They understood the careful folding of clothing that might need to last for years. And yet, inside those difficult lives, there were also moments of softness that faded gently into the ordinary rhythm of the century. A warm loaf of bread cooling near a window. The smell of soap drying beside a basin. Rain tapping quietly against a roof while siblings whispered beneath blankets. The feeling of holding a smooth stone found beside a muddy road. The slow comfort of hearing a mother hum while sewing by candlelight late into the evening. These small moments rarely entered the grand history books. Most historians wrote about kings, railways, empire, and industry. They wrote about inventions, factories, wars, and political speeches delivered beneath heavy chandeliers. But the daily lives of ordinary children often drifted quietly into the background, almost like smoke disappearing into a gray morning sky. Tonight, we move slowly back into that forgotten world. Not into the grand halls of the powerful, but into the smaller rooms where childhood unfolded beside coal fires and narrow beds. The Victorian age stretched across much of the 19th century, during the reign of Queen Victoria. It was a time of enormous change in United Kingdom. Cities grew quickly. Factories rose beside rivers. Steam trains crossed the countryside. Crowded neighborhoods spread outward beneath clouds of industrial smoke. But childhood itself was changing too. Slowly. Unevenly. And often without anyone noticing. In many rural villages, children still woke to the same sounds their grandparents had known. Roosters called from muddy farmyards. Wind moved through hedges. Milk pails clinked softly in the early dawn. The smell of damp earth entered homes through cracked wooden doors. A farm child's morning often began before sunrise. The youngest children might carry water or gather eggs. Older boys worked beside fathers in cold fields where frost clung to the grass. Girls helped knead bread dough, wash clothing, clean vegetables, or care for younger brothers and sisters. Hands became rough at an early age. Fingernails stayed lined with dirt no matter how much scrubbing was done at the basin. The work rarely stopped completely. Even in winter. Especially in winter. The cold season could feel endless in the countryside. Dampness settled into blankets and clothing. Boots stayed muddy for days. Smoke from fireplaces clung to ceilings blackened over many years. Children learned how to sit very close to small fires without wasting precious coal or wood. Many families owned few books. Some children never attended school regularly at all. Before educational reform slowly expanded across Britain, large numbers of working-class children spent more time laboring than learning. Reading and writing were skills connected to opportunity, but survival came first for many families. In industrial towns, childhood carried a different rhythm. Factories changed everything. The sound of machinery became part of daily life, almost like weather itself. Cotton mills thundered from morning until night. Iron foundries hissed with steam. Tall chimneys poured smoke into pale skies. Rivers that once moved quietly through green landscapes became crowded with barges, bridges, and factory walls darkened by soot. Children worked there too. Some were very small. In textile mills, young workers moved carefully between spinning machines. Tiny hands tied broken threads while loud metal frames rattled endlessly nearby. The air often felt thick with dust. Windows stayed shut to protect delicate fibers. Long hours passed beneath gas lamps that cast a dull yellow glow over rows of exhausted faces. Many children grew used to constant noise. But at night, when they finally returned home, silence could feel strangely heavy. They sat quietly beside tired parents. They ate simple meals. Bread. Potatoes. Sometimes broth. Sometimes only tea. The exhaustion settled deep into their bodies long before adulthood arrived. Yet even in those crowded industrial streets, children still found fragments of childhood hidden between the demands of labor. A marble rolling across stone pavement. A scrap of ribbon tied around a doll. A stick dragged through puddles after rain. Laughter echoing briefly through an alley before disappearing into evening fog. The Victorian world often expected children to behave like small adults. Obedience mattered deeply. Respectability mattered deeply. Adults believed discipline shaped character, and many homes followed strict routines built around work, religion, and proper conduct. In middle-class families, children sometimes lived under careful supervision inside homes filled with heavy curtains, polished furniture, and clocks ticking steadily in quiet rooms. Nurses and governesses guided daily lessons. Boys practiced handwriting at narrow desks. Girls learned sewing, music, and household skills thought necessary for future marriage and family life. These children often wore stiff clothing that limited movement. Small boots, buttoned jackets, layered dresses, starched collars pressing against the neck. Portrait photographs from the period show serious faces staring directly toward the camera. Long exposure times required stillness, but the seriousness also reflected the expectations placed upon children. Childhood was not always imagined as carefree. Good behavior carried enormous importance. Yet beneath the formality, ordinary feelings remained unchanged across time. Children still became frightened during thunderstorms. They still missed parents when separated. They still felt lonely in unfamiliar rooms. They still whispered secrets after bedtime. And they still searched for comfort in quiet places. At night, nurseries glowed softly beneath candlelight. Shadows moved gently along wallpaper while rain tapped against windows. Somewhere downstairs, adults continued speaking in low voices over tea and newspapers. Floorboards creaked. Clocks ticked steadily through the darkness. A child listening from bed might hear every sound. The crackle of dying firewood. The distant movement of carriage wheels outside. The wind pressing softly against the house. These moments lingered deeply in memory, though few children could have explained why. In poorer neighborhoods, nights felt different. Entire streets crowded closely together beneath smoke-darkened skies. Thin walls allowed sounds to pass easily between homes. Babies cried. Men returned late from labor. Footsteps echoed along narrow staircases. Water dripped from damaged roofs during heavy rain. Children often slept several to a bed. Some slept on floor mattresses stuffed with straw. Privacy barely existed. Still, families created warmth where they could. Mothers patched torn clothing beneath candlelight. Fathers carved toys from scraps of wood. Older sisters braided younger children's hair before sleep. Songs drifted quietly through cramped rooms while kettles steamed above weak fires. Life moved slowly from one season into another. Winter brought darkness early in the afternoon. Streets became wet and cold. Breath appeared white in the air. Children wrapped scarves tightly while running errands through fog-covered roads. Spring carried the smell of damp soil and horse manure along city streets. Market stalls filled with early vegetables. Laundry fluttered behind crowded buildings. Thin sunlight returned carefully after long gray months. Summer could feel heavy and exhausting, especially in industrial districts where heat mixed with smoke and crowded living conditions. Open windows brought little relief. Dust settled over furniture and clothing. Children played beside canals and rivers despite warnings about disease and pollution. Autumn arrived with wet leaves plastered against sidewalks and the distant smell of chimney fires beginning again. And through every season, childhood continued quietly forward. Victorian schools themselves could feel stern and exhausting. Classrooms were often crowded. Wooden desks sat in stiff rows beneath tall windows. Teachers demanded silence and repetition. Lessons focused heavily on memorization. Children recited facts together in careful rhythm while chalk dust drifted through the air. For many working-class children, attending school regularly remained difficult even after education laws expanded. Families depended on income from child labor. Missing work meant losing money needed for rent, food, or coal during winter. Some children attended night schools after long workdays. Imagine the tiredness. A child sitting beneath dim lamps after hours spent in factories or workshops. Fingers sore. Eyes burning from exhaustion. Trying carefully to copy letters onto rough paper while fighting sleep. Outside, rain might fall softly against dark streets. Inside, the room smelled faintly of wet wool and ink. The teacher's voice moved slowly through the evening air. Some children listened closely because education carried hope. A fragile kind of hope. The hope that life might someday become less difficult. Books themselves held enormous power in Victorian childhood. Even a small collection of stories could feel precious. In wealthier homes, nurseries sometimes contained shelves of fairy tales, adventure novels, history books, and religious stories bound in cloth covers. Poorer children often encountered books far less frequently. But when they did, those stories stayed with them. A borrowed page. A church pamphlet. A newspaper wrapping. Words carried entire worlds beyond crowded streets and endless labor. Some children read secretly by candlelight long after bedtime, careful not to waste expensive candles or attract attention from strict adults. Tiny flames flickered beside blankets while shadows trembled gently against walls. Outside, the city remained restless beneath the night. Far away, factory chimneys still released smoke into darkness. And somewhere, another child was likely still awake too. Victorian illness shaped childhood constantly. Disease moved easily through crowded neighborhoods where sanitation remained poor. Cold weather, weak nutrition, and exhausting labor left many children vulnerable. Families feared scarlet fever, measles, tuberculosis, and influenza. A simple cough could grow serious quickly. Sick rooms often felt very still. Curtains drawn. Basins of water cooling nearby. Soft footsteps crossing wooden floors. Adults speaking in whispers beside beds. Children spent long hours staring toward ceilings while hearing distant street sounds outside the window. Church bells rang faintly through foggy mornings. Rainwater slid slowly down glass panes. Somewhere downstairs, life continued carefully forward. Doctors could offer only limited treatments for many illnesses. So much depended on rest, warmth, hope, and time. Many Victorian families experienced grief quietly and often. Child mortality remained tragically common during the 19th century. Small graves filled churchyards across cities and villages alike. Mourning clothing hung inside wardrobes. Portrait photographs preserved faces that disappeared too early. And because loss occurred so frequently, children themselves became familiar with mourning rituals at young ages. Black ribbons. Silent funerals. Covered mirrors. Heavy curtains drawn against daylight. Yet life continued moving forward, even through sadness. Laundry still needed washing. Bread still needed baking. Work still began before sunrise. Children who survived learned resilience very early. Not the loud kind celebrated in stories, but the quiet kind. The kind built slowly through cold mornings, long labor, crowded homes, and small acts of endurance repeated day after day. As evening settled across Victorian towns, another rhythm began. Workers returned home beneath gas lamps glowing softly through mist. Horses snorted clouds into cold air. Shopkeepers closed shutters. Church bells marked the passing hour while smoke drifted above rooftops. Inside homes, suppers were prepared. Stew simmered slowly. Bread cracked beneath knives. Tea steamed gently beside tired hands. Children gathered around tables or fireplaces depending on the family's circumstances. Some homes remained noisy with conversation. Others stayed nearly silent from exhaustion. After meals came chores. Boots cleaned. Floors swept. Water carried. Buttons repaired. Younger children slowly grew sleepy beside warm fires while older siblings finished evening tasks. Candle flames shortened hour by hour. Then bedtime arrived. Victorian bedrooms varied greatly between rich and poor, yet many shared the same quiet darkness once lamps were extinguished. In wealthy homes, children slept beneath heavy blankets inside carefully decorated nurseries. Moonlight touched polished furniture. Curtains moved slightly in cool night air. The distant sounds of servants finishing late duties echoed faintly through hallways. In poorer districts, families climbed narrow stairs toward cramped attic rooms where cold pressed through thin walls. Mattresses rustled softly as children settled close together beneath patched blankets. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried. Demands of labor. A marble rolling across stone pavement. A scrap of ribbon tied around a doll. A stick dragged through puddles after rain. Laughter echoing briefly through an alley before disappearing into evening fog. The Victorian world often expected children to behave like small adults. Obedience mattered deeply. Respectability mattered deeply. Adults believed discipline shaped character, and many homes followed strict routines built around work, religion, and proper conduct. In middle-class families, children sometimes lived under careful supervision inside homes filled with heavy curtains, polished furniture, and clocks ticking steadily in quiet rooms. Nurses and governesses guided daily lessons. Boys practiced handwriting at narrow desks. Girls learned sewing, music, and household skills thought necessary for future marriage and family life. These children often wore stiff clothing that limited movement. Small boots, buttoned jackets, layered dresses, starched collars pressing against the neck. Portrait photographs from the period show serious faces staring directly toward the camera. Long exposure times required stillness, but the seriousness also reflected the expectations placed upon children. Childhood was not always imagined as carefree. Good behavior carried enormous importance. Yet beneath the formality, ordinary feelings remained unchanged across time. Children still became frightened during thunderstorms. They still missed parents when separated. They still felt lonely in unfamiliar rooms. They still whispered secrets after bedtime. And they still searched for comfort in quiet places. At night, nurseries glowed softly beneath candlelight. Shadows moved gently along wallpaper while rain tapped against windows. Somewhere downstairs, adults continued speaking in low voices over tea and newspapers. Floorboards creaked. Clocks ticked steadily through the darkness. A child listening from bed might hear every sound. The crackle of dying firewood. The distant movement of carriage wheels outside. The wind pressing softly against the house. These moments lingered deeply in memory, though few children could have explained why. In poorer neighborhoods, nights felt different. Entire streets crowded closely together beneath smoke-darkened skies. Thin walls allowed sounds to pass easily between homes. Babies cried. Men returned late from labor. Footsteps echoed along narrow staircases. Water dripped from damaged roofs during heavy rain. Children often slept several to a bed. Some slept on floor mattresses stuffed with straw. Privacy barely existed. Still, families created warmth where they could. Mothers patched torn clothing beneath candlelight. Fathers carved toys from scraps of wood. Older sisters braided younger children's hair before sleep. Songs drifted quietly through cramped rooms while kettles steamed above weak fires. Life moved slowly from one season into another. Winter brought darkness early in the afternoon. Streets became wet and cold. Breath appeared white in the air. Children wrapped scarves tightly while running errands through fog-covered roads. Spring carried the smell of damp soil and horse manure along city streets. Market stalls filled with early vegetables. Laundry fluttered behind crowded buildings. Thin sunlight returned carefully after long gray months. Summer could feel heavy and exhausting, especially in industrial districts where heat mixed with smoke and crowded living conditions. Open windows brought little relief. Dust settled over furniture and clothing. Children played beside canals and rivers despite warnings about disease and pollution. Autumn arrived with wet leaves plastered against sidewalks and the distant smell of chimney fires beginning again. And through every season, childhood continued quietly forward. Victorian schools themselves could feel stern and exhausting. Classrooms were often crowded. Wooden desks sat in stiff rows beneath tall windows. Teachers demanded silence and repetition. Lessons focused heavily on memorization. Children recited facts together in careful rhythm while chalk dust drifted through the air. For many working-class children, attending school regularly remained difficult even after education laws expanded. Families depended on income from child labor. Missing work meant losing money needed for rent, food, or coal during winter. Some children attended night schools after long workdays. Imagine the tiredness. A child sitting beneath dim lamps after hours spent in factories or workshops. Fingers sore. Eyes burning from exhaustion. Trying carefully to copy letters onto rough paper while fighting sleep. Outside, rain might fall softly against dark streets. Inside, the room smelled faintly of wet wool and ink. The teacher's voice moved slowly through the evening air. Some children listened closely because education carried hope. A fragile kind of hope. The hope that life might someday become less difficult. Books themselves held enormous power in Victorian childhood. Even a small collection of stories could feel precious. In wealthier homes, nurseries sometimes contained shelves of fairy tales, adventure novels, history books, and religious stories bound in cloth covers. Poorer children often encountered books far less frequently. But when they did, those stories stayed with them. A borrowed page. A church pamphlet. A newspaper wrapping. Words carried entire worlds beyond crowded streets and endless labor. Some children read secretly by candlelight long after bedtime, careful not to waste expensive candles or attract attention from strict adults. Tiny flames flickered beside blankets while shadows trembled gently against walls. Outside, the city remained restless beneath the night. Far away, factory chimneys still released smoke into darkness. And somewhere, another child was likely still awake too. Victorian illness shaped childhood constantly. Disease moved easily through crowded neighborhoods where sanitation remained poor. Cold weather, weak nutrition, and exhausting labor left many children vulnerable. Families feared scarlet fever, measles, tuberculosis, and influenza. A simple cough could grow serious quickly. Sick rooms often felt very still. Curtains drawn. Basins of water cooling nearby. Soft footsteps crossing wooden floors. Adults speaking in whispers beside beds. Children spent long hours staring toward ceilings while hearing distant street sounds outside the window. Church bells rang faintly through foggy mornings. Rainwater slid slowly down glass panes. Somewhere downstairs, life continued carefully forward. Doctors could offer only limited treatments for many illnesses. So much depended on rest, warmth, hope, and time. Many Victorian families experienced grief quietly and often. Child mortality remained tragically common during the 19th century. Small graves filled churchyards across cities and villages alike. Mourning clothing hung inside wardrobes. Portrait photographs preserved faces that disappeared too early. And because loss occurred so frequently, children themselves became familiar with mourning rituals at young ages. Black ribbons. Silent funerals. Covered mirrors. Heavy curtains drawn against daylight. Yet life continued moving forward, even through sadness. Laundry still needed washing. Bread still needed baking. Work still began before sunrise. Children who survived learned resilience very early. Not the loud kind celebrated in stories, but the quiet kind. The kind built slowly through cold mornings, long labor, crowded homes, and small acts of endurance repeated day after day. As evening settled across Victorian towns, another rhythm began. Workers returned home beneath gas lamps glowing softly through mist. Horses snorted clouds into cold air. Shopkeepers closed shutters. Church bells marked the passing hour while smoke drifted above rooftops. Inside homes, suppers were prepared. Stew simmered slowly. Bread cracked beneath knives. Tea steamed gently beside tired hands. Children gathered around tables or fireplaces depending on the family's circumstances. Some homes remained noisy with conversation. Others stayed nearly silent from exhaustion. After meals came chores. Boots cleaned. Floors swept. Water carried. Buttons repaired. Younger children slowly grew sleepy beside warm fires while older siblings finished evening tasks. Candle flames shortened hour by hour. Then bedtime arrived. Victorian bedrooms varied greatly between rich and poor, yet many shared the same quiet darkness once lamps were extinguished. In wealthy homes, children slept beneath heavy blankets inside carefully decorated nurseries. Moonlight touched polished furniture. Curtains moved slightly in cool night air. The distant sounds of servants finishing late duties echoed faintly through hallways. In poorer districts, families climbed narrow stairs toward cramped attic rooms where cold pressed through thin walls. Mattresses rustled softly as children settled close together beneath patched blankets. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried. Pipes rattled. Wind moved through loose window frames. And gradually, sleep came. The city outside never fully rested. Factories prepared for another dawn. Markets waited for morning deliveries. Coal smoke drifted endlessly upward into the dark. But for a few quiet hours, Victorian childhood rested beneath the same night sky that stretched across fields, rivers, villages, and crowded industrial streets alike. A long day finally ended. And another waited patiently beyond the darkness. Before dawn fully arrived, the streets of Victorian cities often belonged to workers moving silently through the cold. Milk carts rolled over uneven stones. Bakers unlocked heavy doors while ovens already glowed with orange heat inside dark kitchens. Chimney sweeps crossed narrow alleys carrying brushes over their shoulders. Newspaper boys hurried through the mist with stacks tucked beneath thin arms. And among them walked children. Some still half asleep. Some barefoot inside worn shoes with broken soles. Some carrying lunch wrapped in cloth. The sky above London, Manchester, Liverpool, and countless smaller towns slowly shifted from deep blue into pale grey. Smoke drifted upward from thousands of chimneys. Church towers emerged faintly through the fog. Window shutters opened one by one as households prepared for another day shaped by labor and routine. Victorian childhood often moved according to the clock long before children understood time itself. Factory whistles controlled entire neighborhoods. School bells gathered crowds into classrooms. Markets opened at dawn. Domestic servants rose before the families they served. Even very young children learned to recognize the meaning of certain sounds carried through the morning air. The sharp whistle from the mill. The bell from the parish church. The knock of boots along staircases. The crackling fire being lit downstairs. These sounds became the structure of daily life. In working-class districts, mornings inside homes could feel crowded and hurried. Entire families shared very little space. A single room might contain beds, cooking tools, chairs, laundry, and sleeping children all together beneath one low ceiling stained dark by years of smoke. The first person awake often lit the fire if coal was available. Sometimes there was enough. Sometimes not. When fuel ran low during winter, families saved every piece carefully. Children learned how precious warmth could be. They stood close to weak flames while pulling on stiff clothing still damp from the previous day's rain. Breakfast was often simple. Bread spread thinly with dripping or jam if affordable. Porridge steaming gently in metal bowls. Tea poured carefully to stretch limited supplies. The smell of baking bread drifting from nearby streets sometimes filled entire neighborhoods during the early hours. For hungry children walking toward factories or workshops, that smell lingered painfully in the cold air. Not every child worked in factories. Many worked inside homes. Victorian domestic service employed enormous numbers of young people, especially girls. Some entered service at very young ages, leaving rural villages to live inside unfamiliar city houses where they cleaned fireplaces, carried water, scrubbed floors, polished silver, and answered bells throughout endless days. A young servant girl might wake before sunrise to begin lighting fires in bedrooms still dark with sleep. Her hands would already feel cold before touching the iron grate. Ash dust would cling beneath her fingernails. The house remained quiet except for floorboards creaking beneath careful footsteps. Outside, the city slowly brightened beneath clouds of smoke and winter mist. Domestic servants often lived almost invisibly inside wealthy households. They moved silently through hallways carrying trays, linens, and candles while family life unfolded around them. Many were still children themselves, though responsibility quickly aged them. Some became deeply lonely. Letters from home arrived rarely. Visits home might happen only once or twice each year. Yet small comforts still existed. A warm kitchen late at night after duties ended. Shared laughter between servants downstairs. The smell of fresh bread cooling beside large ovens. A quiet moment near a window watching snow fall over the street outside. In rural areas, childhood remained closely tied to nature and the changing seasons. Farm children understood weather in intimate ways. They watched clouds carefully. They recognized the smell of rain before storms arrived. They knew how frost changed the fields and how muddy roads could slow entire days of work. Spring mornings in the countryside carried soft birdsong and damp air drifting across fields. Mist rested low over rivers and hedges while sunlight slowly touched the tops of trees. Children walked beside parents through narrow dirt roads lined with stone walls and wet grass. Many rural homes remained small and simple. Floors creaked beneath worn boots. Water came from pumps or wells. Candles remained expensive enough to use sparingly. Children often slept in attic rooms beneath sloping roofs where wind could be heard moving outside during storms. During harvest seasons, entire families worked together from morning until evening. Children gathered crops beneath warm sunlight while dust rose gently from dry ground. Horses pulled heavy wagons across fields. Workers rested briefly beneath trees with bread, cheese, and tea carried from home in baskets. The labor felt endless sometimes. But there were quieter moments too. A child lying briefly in tall grass while clouds drifted overhead. The distant sound of river water moving slowly past reeds. The warmth of sunlight drying damp clothing after rain. Victorian children spent much of their lives outdoors, especially among poorer families. Streets themselves became places of work, play, argument, and survival. Children sold flowers, matches, newspapers, and small goods in crowded public spaces. Others ran errands through busy markets where voices mixed with horse hooves and rattling carts. Street life carried its own rhythm. Fishmongers shouted prices near crowded docks. Factory smoke darkened the sky by afternoon. Rainwater collected in uneven gutters. Gas lamps flickered softly after sunset. Children learned quickly how to move through these spaces. They crossed crowded roads between horses and wagons. They avoided dangerous corners at night. They searched for warmth during winter wherever it could be found. Some gathered beside bakery windows just to feel heat escaping into the street. Others stood near factory vents where warm air drifted upward. Evenings often brought exhaustion so deep that children fell asleep sitting upright beside fires before reaching bed. Victorian clothing shaped childhood in quiet ways too. For wealthy children, clothing reflected status and discipline. Dresses contained layers of fabric difficult to move freely within. Boys wore stiff collars and carefully buttoned jackets. Clothing needed to remain neat, especially in public. Middle-class families valued cleanliness and presentation deeply. Mothers worried about mud stains, torn stockings, and proper posture. Photographs from the era often show children posed carefully beside furniture or painted backdrops, standing unnaturally still beneath the long gaze of the camera. Poorer children wore clothing repeatedly patched and repaired. Older garments passed down between siblings. Shoes became worn thin. Sleeves shortened as children grew taller. Laundry itself demanded enormous labor. Water had to be heated. Clothing scrubbed by hand. Sheets wrung dry and hung carefully even during cold weather. Children often helped with these tasks from very early ages. A small child might spend hours turning heavy laundry handles or carrying buckets across muddy yards while cold wind pushed against wet sleeves. And still, there remained ordinary moments of tenderness within these difficult routines. A mother warming socks beside the fire before morning. An older sister carefully sewing a missing button. A father carrying a sleeping child upstairs after a long day. Victorian parents loved their children deeply, even when hardship limited how that love could be expressed openly. The age often encouraged emotional restraint, especially among adults. Affection was quieter than modern audiences might expect. But it existed everywhere. In careful sacrifices. In warm meals saved for children first. In exhausted parents continuing to work through illness. In blankets adjusted gently during the night. Religion also shaped Victorian childhood constantly. Church bells marked the passing week. Sunday services gathered families into cold stone buildings where candlelight flickered softly against stained glass windows. Children learned hymns, prayers, and moral lessons from an early age. For many, Sundays felt very different from ordinary workdays. Factories paused. Schools closed. Families wore cleaner clothing if possible. The streets themselves grew quieter. A child sitting inside a Victorian church might remember the smell of damp wool coats drying near wooden pews. Rain tapped softly against high windows while the minister's voice echoed through the large room. Candles glowed beside polished brass. Dust drifted slowly through pale light. After services, families often walked home together beneath gray skies while bells continued ringing faintly behind them. In wealthier homes, Sundays sometimes included reading aloud beside the fireplace. Parents turned pages slowly while children listened quietly beneath warm lamplight. Outside, horse carriages rolled through wet evening streets. In poorer homes, rest remained limited because survival still demanded labor. Clothing needed mending. Food needed preparing. Water needed carrying. Yet even there, Sundays sometimes brought small pauses from the harshest routines. A slower breakfast. An afternoon walk. A song shared quietly before bed. Victorian schools varied enormously depending on wealth and location. Elite private schools prepared upper-class boys for leadership, government, and empire. Strict discipline shaped daily life inside stone buildings where students followed rigid schedules under the supervision of stern masters. Younger children often felt homesick during their first months away from family. Dormitories could feel cold and lonely at night. Candlelight flickered against rows of beds while distant footsteps echoed through hallways. Letters from home became treasured possessions carefully reread many times. For girls in wealthier families, education focused differently. Many learned literature, music, drawing, sewing, and social etiquette. Academic subjects sometimes remained limited because society expected women to become wives and mothers above all else. Still, many girls quietly developed deep intelligence and curiosity. Some read secretly late into the night. Some wrote poetry hidden inside drawers. Some dreamed silently of wider worlds beyond the narrow expectations placed upon them. Meanwhile, countless working-class children received only fragmented schooling or none at all. Even after reforms expanded education, poverty continued limiting opportunity. A child might attend school one month and work the next. Seasons affected attendance too. Harvest periods pulled rural children back into the fields. Illness spread quickly through crowded classrooms. Shoes wore out during winter. And many parents simply could not afford the loss of wages that education required. Victorian toys reflected the world around children. Simple wooden animals. Handmade dolls with stitched faces. Hoops rolled along dusty streets. Marbles clicked softly against stone. Paper kites lifted briefly above smoky rooftops when weather allowed. Wealthier nurseries sometimes contained elaborate dollhouses, tin soldiers, painted blocks, or miniature tea sets arranged carefully inside cabinets. Christmas mornings in prosperous homes glowed with candlelight reflecting off polished toys beneath decorated trees. But poorer children often created play from whatever materials they could find. Scraps of cloth became dolls. Sticks became horses or swords. Old buttons became game pieces. Imagination filled the spaces left by poverty. Children played beside canals, empty lots, alleyways, and crowded courtyards. Their laughter echoed briefly between brick walls before dissolving back into the endless sounds of the city. And then evening returned again. Smoke thickened over rooftops. Gas lamps flickered awake one by one. Cold air settled through narrow streets. Inside homes, supper simmered slowly over small fires while tired children rubbed sore eyes beside the table. Victorian nights carried a particular stillness once the city quieted after midnight. Horses became less frequent. Factory noise softened in the distance. Rainwater dripped steadily from roofs into dark alleys. Children lying awake during those hours often listened carefully to the world around them. The ticking clock downstairs. Wind pressing softly against windows. A parent coughing quietly in another room. Footsteps fading along distant streets. The darkness itself felt deep in the 19th century. Without electric light, much of the world disappeared completely after candles were extinguished. Shadows filled hallways. Moonlight silvered rooftops and chimneys outside. Entire neighborhoods rested beneath dim gas lamps surrounded by drifting fog. For many children, nighttime became the only moment when labor and expectation finally loosened their grip. A tired factory boy staring upward from bed might imagine rivers, forests, or distant oceans he had never seen. A servant girl beneath attic blankets might remember the fields surrounding her childhood home far away in the countryside. A young student at boarding school might quietly miss the sound of family voices downstairs at night. These private thoughts rarely entered official history. But they existed. Softly. Quietly. Inside thousands upon thousands of ordinary lives. And beyond the sleeping streets, another Victorian morning already waited patiently beneath the dark sky. In the quieter corners of Victorian homes, where candlelight settled softly against faded wallpaper and the smell of coal smoke lingered in the curtains, childhood often unfolded through small routines repeated day after day. Many children learn the shape of life through repetition. The same staircases climbed every morning. The same cracked bowls placed carefully on the same wooden tables. The same streets walked beneath rain, fog, or pale winter sunlight. And because these routines rarely changed, the smallest differences could feel important. A fresh loaf cooling by the fire. A warm scarf newly knitted for winter. An orange brought home at Christmas. An unexpected afternoon without work because heavy rain flooded the roads. These moments settled deeply into memory. Victorian homes themselves held many different worlds inside them. A wealthy townhouse in London felt entirely different from a labourer's cottage near northern factories or a fishing family's small home beside the coast. Yet all of them shared certain quiet features of the century. The sound of clocks. The glow of candles. The careful saving of heat during winter. The smell of damp wool drying near fireplaces. And children moving quietly through adult spaces, trying to understand the rules of the world around them. In poorer homes, furniture was often sparse and heavily worn. Wooden chairs became smooth from years of use. Tables carried scratches from countless meals and repairs. Blankets were folded carefully each morning because the same room might serve as kitchen, dining room, and bedroom all within a single day. Space mattered enormously. Privacy barely existed. Children grew up hearing every conversation, every argument, every cough in the night. The walls themselves often seemed thin enough to breathe through. A child lying awake could hear neighbors speaking next door, footsteps crossing upstairs, or the distant rumble of wagons moving through wet streets outside. During storms, rain tapped against roofs while cold air crept slowly through loose windows and cracked doors. Still, families tried to make these homes feel gentle where they could. Small flowers placed in jars near windows. Polished teacups saved for Sundays. A favorite chair beside the fire. A carefully folded quilt stitched by hand over many winters. Even in hardship, people searched quietly for beauty. Victorian mothers spent enormous amounts of time managing homes under difficult conditions. Water had to be heated manually. Clothing washed by hand. Floors scrubbed repeatedly against soot and mud constantly carried inside from the streets. Cooking alone required hours of preparation each day. Children watched all of this closely. Girls especially learned domestic routines very early. Many could sew, wash, clean, and cook simple meals before reaching adolescence. Boys often helped carry coal, chop wood, run errands, or assist fathers in workshops and labor. Work and childhood rarely existed separately. They blended together slowly. A little girl rocking a baby sibling while soup simmered nearby. A boy cleaning tools beside his father in fading evening light. Hands learning responsibility before they fully lost the softness of youth. Victorian kitchens carried their own atmosphere entirely. The warmth of iron stoves. Steam clouding the windows. The smell of onions frying slowly in dripping. Fresh bread cooling beneath cloth. Kettles murmuring softly over flame. For many children, the kitchen became the emotional center of the home, especially during winter evenings when cold darkness pressed against the windows outside. Family members gathered there not only for food but for warmth itself. Stories were sometimes shared quietly after supper. Not dramatic stories. Just ordinary memories. A neighbor's wedding. A difficult winter years earlier. A horse escaping into the street. A river flooding nearby fields. Children listened carefully while adults spoke beside the fire. Shadows moved slowly across the ceiling while candle flames bent gently whenever doors opened. These moments passed without ceremony. Yet they became the texture of life itself. Victorian childhood also carried long stretches of waiting. Waiting for bread to bake. Waiting for parents to return from work. Waiting for illness to pass. Waiting for warmer weather after endless winter rain. Time moved differently during the 19th century. Without modern entertainment or constant noise, silence filled much of the day. Children became familiar with boredom in a very deep way. But boredom also sharpened observation. A child sitting quietly near a window might spend long periods watching rain slide down the glass. They noticed stray cats moving carefully along alleyways. They watched chimney smoke bending in the wind. They listened to church bells echoing across rooftops. The world revealed itself slowly. Victorian weather shaped daily life constantly. Winter cold settled heavily over industrial cities where coal smoke trapped fog close to the ground. Streets became dark by late afternoon. Lamps glowed through thick mist while horse hooves splashed through muddy roads. Children wrapped scarves tightly around their faces while hurrying through the cold. Fingers became numb quickly. Boots soaked through. Breath floated pale in the air beneath gas lamps. Inside schools, classrooms often remained chilly despite small fires burning near the front. Ink froze during severe winters. Children sat wearing coats while trying to copy lessons onto rough paper with stiff hands. Teachers themselves sometimes struggled against exhaustion. Many classrooms held far too many students. The air smelled of chalk, wet wool, and damp wood. Outside, snow occasionally softened the harshness of Victorian streets. Rooftops turned white. Factory smoke drifted upward against pale skies. Children rushed outdoors whenever possible, laughing briefly while throwing snowballs or sliding across frozen ground before returning to work or chores. Even the poorest neighborhoods changed beneath snowfall. For a short time, dirt and soot disappeared beneath silence. Then spring slowly arrived again. Rainwater flowed along crowded gutters. The first green leaves appeared beside brick walls. Markets filled with vegetables carried in from surrounding farms. Children spent longer hours outdoors after months of cold darkness. In rural villages, spring brought endless labor. Fields needed planting. Animals needed care. Mud clung thickly to boots after heavy rains. Birds returned to hedges and trees while rivers moved high and brown with melted snow. A farm child understood these seasonal changes intimately. Morning sunlight warming cold hands after frost. The smell of wet earth turned by plows. Wind moving softly through tall grass. The distant sound of sheep calling across hills. Victorian childhood in the countryside often carried loneliness too. Villages could remain isolated for long periods, especially during bad weather. Roads became difficult. Travel remained slow. Some children spent most of their lives within only a few miles of where they were born. And yet their imaginations stretched far beyond those narrow distances. Adventure stories circulated slowly through books, newspapers, and traveling storytellers. Tales of distant seas, deserts, forests, and foreign cities reached even quiet rural homes eventually. Children listened beside fires while rain fell outside, imagining places they would never see. For working-class children especially, imagination became a kind of private shelter. A momentary escape from exhaustion. A softer world carried silently inside the mind. Victorian illness remained everywhere in daily life. Cities struggled with overcrowding and poor sanitation. Open drains, polluted water, and cramped housing helped disease spread quickly through neighborhoods. Children became sick often. Some recovered slowly beneath blankets near the fire. Others did not. Families learned not to speak too loudly about fear, but it lived quietly beneath ordinary routines. A mother checking a child's forehead during the night. Parents listening for difficult breathing in dark rooms. Medicines lined carefully beside the bed. Doctors arriving through rain with black bags and tired eyes. Sick children often spent long hours staring toward windows while life continued outside beyond their reach. Street vendors called through the fog. Horses passed slowly beneath umbrellas. Church bells rang softly across damp rooftops. The world kept moving. Victorian hospitals themselves could feel cold and unsettling, especially for children. Long wards smelled of soap, medicine, and coal smoke. Iron beds stood in careful rows beneath tall windows. Nurses moved quietly between patients carrying water basins and folded linens. Many families feared hospitals deeply because survival there remained uncertain. So care usually happened at home whenever possible. Relatives gathered around sick beds. Neighbors delivered broth or bread. Candles burned low through the night while exhausted parents remained awake beside sleeping children. And then, once recovery finally came, ordinary life resumed almost immediately. There was rarely time for long rest. Work still waited. Laundry still needed washing. Bills still needed paying. Victorian fathers often spent long hours away from home. Industrial labor could stretch from dawn until evening 6 days each week. Coal miners descended underground before sunrise. Dock workers unloaded ships beside freezing rivers. Factory laborers stood beside machinery for exhausting shifts beneath clouds of heat and dust. Children sometimes saw fathers only briefly during weekdays. A tired figure entering the house after dark. Boots heavy with mud or coal dust. Hands rough from labor. Shoulders bent with exhaustion. Evenings often unfolded quietly because fatigue left little energy for conversation. Families sat near the fire while supper cooled on simple plates. Some fathers read newspapers beneath weak lamplight. Others simply rested in silence while children played softly nearby. Yet small gestures carried deep meaning. A hand resting gently on a child's shoulder. A father carving a toy boat from scrap wood. A tired parent carrying a sleeping child to bed. These ordinary acts of tenderness rarely appeared in official records, but they shaped childhood powerfully. Victorian childhood also involved constant awareness of social class. Even children recognized differences between rich and poor from very early ages. Clothing, speech, food, neighborhoods, schools, and opportunities all reflected social position. A wealthy child riding through London in a carriage might glimpse barefoot children selling flowers beside the road. A poor child delivering packages to elegant homes might stare quietly at carpets, chandeliers, and tables filled with food. The contrast existed everywhere. And children noticed more than adults sometimes realized. Middle-class families worked carefully to appear respectable. Cleanliness became almost a moral value during the Victorian period. Children learned posture, manners, and proper speech because outward behavior reflected family reputation. Mothers corrected posture at dinner tables. Teachers punished untidy handwriting. Boots needed polishing. Hair needed brushing. Even emotions were expected to remain controlled in many situations. Children learned restraint early. Especially boys. Crying openly could be discouraged. Obedience mattered deeply. Silence during lessons mattered deeply. Self-discipline became tied to ideas of morality and success throughout the century. Yet beneath these expectations, children still experienced ordinary fears and comforts. Fear of dark hallways at night. Fear of strict teachers. Fear of disappointing parents. Comfort in familiar songs. Comfort in warm soup after cold rain. Comfort in hearing adult voices nearby before sleep. As evening settled once more across Victorian streets, lamps glowed softly through gathering fog. Shops closed their shutters. Horses pulled the final carts homeward through muddy roads. Smoke drifted low above rooftops while church clocks marked another passing hour. Inside homes, children slowly prepared for bed. Water splashed into basins. Shoes lined carefully beside walls. Candles shortened quietly beside family photographs and folded clothing. Some children shared crowded mattresses with siblings. Others slept alone in carefully arranged nurseries. Some fell asleep immediately from exhaustion. Others lay awake listening to the breathing of everyone around them. Outside, rain might begin softly against the windows. Far away, factory whistles sounded through the darkness. And somewhere in the great sleeping city, countless other children closed tired eyes beneath the same drifting smoke and pale Victorian moonlight. Morning returned slowly over the Victorian world, not with sudden brightness, but with a gradual softening of darkness across rooftops, chimneys, and narrow streets still damp from the night before. The first light often arrived hidden behind fog. In London especially, dawn could feel muted and grey for hours. Smoke from thousands of coal fires drifted heavily through the air, mixing with river mist rising from the River Thames. Chimneys stood like dark shapes against pale skies. Window glass carried beads of moisture. Horses exhaled clouds into the cold while carts rattled slowly toward markets already beginning to stir awake. Inside many homes, children rose reluctantly from sleep. Blankets still held warmth while the room beyond felt bitterly cold. A child's feet touching the floorboards in winter could feel like stepping onto ice. The fire downstairs might have gone out during the night. Ash rested quietly inside the grate while adults prepared kindling with tired hands. Before breakfast, before work, before school, there was always the effort of beginning again. Victorian mornings demanded energy even from the exhausted. Young girls brushed tangled hair before cracked mirrors. Boys buttoned shirts still smelling faintly of smoke and rain. Water from pitchers felt painfully cold against sleepy faces. Outside, bells rang faintly through the mist. For many children, especially among the poor, the day began with errands. Bread had to be collected. Coal purchased if money allowed. Water carried from pumps into heavy buckets that strained thin arms. Streets slowly filled with movement as shopkeepers swept doorways and laborers crossed the city beneath dark coats and caps. The smell of the Victorian city changed hour by hour. Morning carried bread, smoke, whetstone, horses, river water, and coal. By afternoon came dust, sweat, factory steam, and crowded markets. At night, cold fog returned once again. Children knew these smells intimately because they lived constantly inside them. In industrial districts, factory whistles cut sharply through the early air. Entire neighborhoods responded immediately. Doors opened. Workers poured into the streets. Boots struck pavement in hurried rhythm while smoke thickened overhead. Among the adults walked children barely tall enough to keep pace. Some worked in textile mills where spinning frames thundered endlessly beneath gas lamps. Others labored in pottery workshops, match factories, rope yards, brick fields, or mines. Victorian industry depended heavily upon small hands and obedient workers. Inside textile mills, mornings began with noise so loud it became almost physical. Machinery shook the wooden floors. Belts spun overhead. Cotton dust floated through narrow beams of light near the windows. Young workers moved quickly between machines. Their fingers learned speed through necessity. Mistakes could bring punishment or injury. Yet within this exhausting world, moments of quiet humanity still survived. Workers sharing bread during brief breaks. An older girl helping a younger child thread broken cotton. Someone humming softly beneath the roar of machinery. The sound almost disappearing before it fully formed. Factories shaped childhood not only through labor, but through exhaustion afterward. Children returned home with aching feet and burning eyes. Some fell asleep before supper. Others sat silently near the fire too tired even for conversation. Still, tomorrow always arrived. And work waited again. In wealthier households, childhood unfolded more slowly, though not always more freely. Middle-class and upper-class children lived under close supervision. Schedules organized much of the day. Lessons, meals, walks, reading hours, piano practice, and bedtime followed careful routines designed to build discipline and character. A governess might guide children through geography lessons while rain streaked the windows outside. Maps hung neatly beside bookshelves. Ink bottles rested on polished desks. The room smelled faintly of paper, candle wax, and burning coal from the fireplace nearby. These children often spent large portions of the day indoors. Girls embroidered delicate patterns onto cloth while learning proper posture and manners. Boys studied Latin, arithmetic, and history beneath the watchful eye of tutors or schoolmasters. Adults believed structure protected children from laziness or moral weakness. Even play was sometimes supervised carefully. But childhood always found quiet ways to escape control. A child staring out the window instead of practicing lessons. Secret stories whispered beneath blankets after bedtime. Small treasures hidden inside drawers. Pressed flowers between book pages. Tiny acts of imagination unfolding silently beneath the ordered surface of Victorian family life. Nurseries themselves carried a strange peacefulness during the late afternoon hours. Sunlight faded slowly across wallpaper decorated with animals, flowers, or faded patterns. Toys rested abandoned on rugs. A fire crackled gently while nurses folded laundry or prepared children for evening meals. Outside, carriage wheels rolled through wet streets below. Inside, time seemed softer. Younger children often lived partly separated from adults within these large homes. Meals might be eaten upstairs in the nursery rather than with parents. Daily care came largely from servants. Some children formed stronger emotional bonds with nurses and governesses than with their own mothers or fathers. This arrangement was considered perfectly ordinary among wealthy families. Still, children sometimes longed quietly for greater closeness. A father too busy with work or politics. A mother occupied by social duties and formal visits. Love existed, but often at a distance shaped by Victorian expectations. Meanwhile, in poor districts crowded beside factories and docks, family closeness happened naturally through necessity. Entire lives unfolded within only a few rooms. Children slept beside parents, worked beside siblings, and shared nearly every moment of daily existence together. This closeness brought comfort. But it also meant children witnessed adult hardship very clearly. They saw unpaid bills. They heard arguments about money. They noticed illness, exhaustion, and fear long before adulthood. A child sitting quietly beside the fire might watch a mother carefully counting coins at the table late at night. Candlelight trembled softly over her tired face while rain tapped against the windows. Nothing needed explaining. The child understood enough already. Victorian food reflected social class sharply as well. Wealthy families enjoyed large dinners with roasted meats, fresh vegetables, puddings, breads, and imported tea served beneath glowing lamps and polished silver. Poor families survived on simpler meals repeated often. Bread, potatoes, porridge, tea. Occasionally broth or small amounts of meat when affordable. Yet even simple food carried emotional comfort. The smell of soup simmering slowly after a cold day. Fresh bread warming cold hands. A baked potato wrapped in cloth during winter evenings. Children remembered these small sensations for the rest of their lives. Street markets brought brief color and movement into industrial neighborhoods. Vendors arranged vegetables, fish, flowers, and cloth beneath canvas coverings while crowds pushed slowly through muddy lanes. Children ran errands carrying baskets or coins carefully clutched inside small hands. Voices echoed everywhere. Merchants calling prices. Horses stamping impatiently. Women bargaining beside crowded stalls. Rainwater dripping steadily from awnings overhead. For children, markets could feel both exciting and overwhelming. So many smells. So many sounds. So much movement beneath the grey Victorian sky. Some children worked there too, selling matches, newspapers, watercress, or flowers from morning until evening. Their voices became part of the city itself. Flowers, sir. Fresh papers. Matches. Small voices drifting through fog and smoke. Victorian childhood beside rivers and docks carried another rhythm entirely. Port cities remained crowded with ships arriving from across the world. Sailors unloaded crates beside muddy wharves while gulls circled overhead through pale skies. Children living near the water often spent long hours wandering docks or riverbanks. The smell there differed from inland streets. Salt. Wet wood. Fish. Tar. River mud. A dock worker's child might fall asleep each night hearing ropes creak against ships and distant bells moving through the foggy harbor. Some boys dreamed of becoming sailors themselves one day, imagining distant oceans far beyond the smoke-covered city. Many never traveled farther than nearby neighborhoods. But the dreams remained. Victorian winters often felt endless for poor families. Coal shortages brought constant anxiety. Frost gathered inside window corners. Water basins froze overnight during severe cold. Children wore layers indoors while huddling close to weak fires that barely warmed the room. Night arrived early during winter months. Darkness settled over the city before supper. Gas lamps glowed softly through fog while footsteps echoed along wet pavement outside. Inside crowded homes, evening routines unfolded quietly. Laundry drying beside the fire. Needles moving through torn fabric. Tea steaming in chipped cups. Children slowly becoming sleepy beneath blankets draped across chairs. These ordinary scenes rarely entered official history. Yet they formed the true rhythm of Victorian childhood far more than royal ceremonies or political speeches. The 19th century also brought growing ideas about childhood itself. Some reformers began arguing that children deserved protection, education, and gentler treatment. Slowly, attitudes shifted. Laws changed gradually over time. Child labor restrictions expanded little by little. But change came unevenly. And slowly. Many children continued working exhausting hours long after society began discussing reform. Still, new ideas drifted quietly through schools, churches, newspapers, and homes. Adults increasingly spoke about innocence, morality, and the emotional importance of childhood. Certain families began valuing play, education, and affection more openly than previous generations had. Victorian literature reflected this changing awareness. Stories about poor children, orphaned children, lonely children, and hard-working children became widely read throughout Britain. Readers wept over fictional suffering while real children continued laboring outside factory gates and crowded markets. And perhaps this contradiction defined much of the Victorian age itself. Immense compassion existing beside immense hardship. Softness beside severity. Warm parlors only streets away from desperate poverty. Children lived inside all these contradictions quietly, often without fully understanding them. As evening deepened once again, smoke drifted above rooftops beneath a pale moon hidden behind clouds. Church bells echoed softly through the cold air. Factory doors released streams of weary workers into darkening streets. Children walked home beside adults with slow, tired steps. Boots splashed through puddles reflecting gaslight. Hands stayed buried inside coat pockets against the cold. Some carried bread home for supper. Others carried nothing at all. Inside homes, lamps were lit carefully to save oil or candles. Families gathered once more around tables worn smooth by years of use. Supper steamed gently while shadows flickered along the walls. Conversation remained soft. Exhaustion settled over the room like another kind of darkness. And gradually, one by one, children drifted toward sleep again beneath the long quiet night of Victorian England. By the middle years of the 19th century, the great cities of Victorian Britain had become places of constant motion. Smoke moved endlessly above rooftops. Steam rose from railway stations. Crowds flowed through markets and alleyways from dawn until deep into the evening. Yet beneath all this movement, childhood often remained strangely still. Many children lived inside small circles of routine that changed very little from one day to the next. A single street. A single factory. A single classroom. A single narrow bed beneath a leaking roof. The world around them modernized quickly, but their own lives moved slowly. Especially for the poor. In London, entire families crowded into neighborhoods where the streets remained damp almost year-round. Tall brick buildings stood pressed closely together. Laundry lines stretched between windows overhead. Rainwater collected beside broken stones while stray dogs wandered through the fog. Children knew these streets intimately. They memorized which baker sometimes offered stale bread at day's end. Which alley flooded during storms. Which policeman might chase them away from certain corners. Which windows glowed warmly at night during winter. The city itself became part of their childhood, almost like another living presence. In the early mornings, before much of the city fully woke, there could be moments of surprising quiet. The fog rested low along the streets. Chimneys smoked gently into pale skies. Shop signs creaked softly in the wind. A child carrying milk or bread through those silent streets might hear only distant footsteps and the faint rumble of carts far away. For a brief time, the enormous city seemed calm. Then the noise returned again. Factories. Markets. Train whistles. Voices. Horses. And the endless rhythm of work. Victorian railways changed childhood in subtle ways too. Steam trains crossed the countryside carrying coal, mail, goods, and passengers between distant towns faster than ever before. For many children, the sight of a train remained deeply fascinating. The dark engine breathing smoke into the sky. The heavy iron wheels clattering against rails. The long whistle echoing across fields and villages. Poor children sometimes stood near railway bridges simply to watch the trains pass beneath them. Wealthier children traveled aboard them with families during holidays or school journeys, staring from windows as the countryside rolled slowly by. Villages. Rivers. Fields. Factories. Church towers. All moving past beneath drifting clouds. For some children, trains represented possibility itself. A road leading somewhere beyond familiar streets and endless routines. But most remained where they were born. Victorian cities could feel enormous and strangely isolating at the same time. Crowds surrounded children constantly, yet loneliness remained common. Many worked long hours with little companionship beyond other exhausted laborers. Some children lost parents early to illness or industrial accidents. Others lived in workhouses after families fell into extreme poverty. The Victorian workhouse stood as one of the harshest institutions of the age. Built to house the poor, these places often separated families upon arrival. Men, women, and children lived apart under strict rules designed to discourage dependence on public assistance. For children, entering a workhouse could feel deeply frightening. Long corridors echoed with footsteps. Uniform clothing replaced familiar garments. Meals became plain and repetitive. The atmosphere itself felt cold, orderly, and heavily controlled. Silence was often enforced during meals. Beds stood in careful rows. Windows allowed pale light into large rooms smelling faintly of soap and damp stone. Some children remained there only temporarily during family hardship. Others spent much of childhood inside such institutions. And even there, small acts of kindness still appeared quietly. An older child helping a younger one make the bed. A nurse offering an extra piece of bread. A shared whisper after lights out in the dormitory. Human warmth survived even inside harsh places. Orphaned children faced uncertain futures throughout the Victorian period. Some entered charitable homes run by churches or private organizations. Others worked from very early ages simply to survive. The streets themselves became home for certain children. They slept beneath bridges, inside abandoned buildings, or in crowded lodging houses filled with strangers. Nights brought particular danger during winter when cold fog settled heavily over the city. A homeless child might wander the streets long after midnight searching for warmth from bakery ovens or factory vents. Gas lamps glowed weakly through the mist while footsteps echoed along empty roads. The city could feel enormous then. Cold. Silent. Endless. And yet many children survived through resilience learned far too early. Victorian society often admired self-discipline and endurance. Adults praised children who worked hard, obeyed rules, and remained quiet despite discomfort. Complaining carried shame in many environments. So children learned to endure. Cold classrooms. Heavy labor. Hunger. Illness. Loneliness. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Just quietly, day after day. In fishing villages along the coast, childhood followed the rhythms of the sea. The smell of salt and seaweed drifted constantly through the air. Boats creaked against wooden docks while gulls circled overhead beneath pale skies. Children there often woke before sunrise as fishermen prepared nets and lanterns in the darkness. The sea shaped everything. Weather determined income. Storms brought fear. Calm waters brought relief. A fisherman's child learned early how quickly nature could change. Bright mornings sometimes turned dangerous by afternoon. Wind battered small homes beside the shore while waves crashed heavily against rocks through the night. Yet coastal childhood also carried moments of great quiet beauty. Sunrise spreading across still water. Shells scattered along wet sand. The distant sound of bells drifting over the harbor fog. Children collecting smooth stones while cold waves touched their boots. Victorian seasons felt deeply connected to survival. Summer heat in crowded industrial districts could become oppressive. Narrow streets trapped warmth beneath smoke-filled skies. Windows opened, but fresh air remained scarce in poor neighborhoods packed closely together. Children slept restlessly during hot nights. Sweat dampened pillows. Street noise continued long after dark. The smell of horses, refuse, and factory smoke lingered heavily in the warm air. Some families escaped briefly to parks or riverbanks on rare free afternoons. Green spaces became precious refuges from the crowded city. Children removed shoes beside streams, climbed trees, or simply rested beneath open skies far from machinery and brick. These moments felt rare enough to remain unforgettable. A cool breeze moving through leaves. Grass beneath tired feet. Clouds drifting slowly overhead. The simple relief of space and silence. Victorian parks themselves became important during the century as cities expanded. Reformers believed public green spaces improved both health and morality. Families walked carefully maintained paths while children played beside ponds and flower gardens. Middle-class families especially valued these outings. Mothers pushed prams beneath shaded trees. Fathers read newspapers on benches. Children sailed toy boats across quiet water. Bands sometimes played music from open pavilions during summer evenings while lamps glowed softly among the trees. But even parks reflected class differences. Wealthier children arrived neatly dressed beneath careful supervision. Poor children often came barefoot or in patched clothing after exhausting work weeks. Still, beneath the trees, these differences sometimes softened briefly. Childhood itself carried similar longings regardless of wealth. Rest, warmth, safety, affection, a little freedom beneath the open sky. Victorian holidays offered rare breaks from routine. Christmas especially held growing emotional importance during the 19th century. Families decorated homes with greenery and candlelight while cold winds moved outside through dark streets. For children, Christmas mornings could feel magical even in modest homes. An orange in a stocking. A handmade toy wrapped carefully in cloth. Warm pudding steaming beside the table. Songs drifting softly through candlelit rooms. Poor families often saved for weeks to create even small celebrations. Mothers baked special bread or cakes when possible. Fathers carved toys from scraps of wood. Children waited eagerly for tiny moments of brightness during the long winter darkness. Snow falling outside made these scenes feel even quieter. The fire crackling softly. Wet boots drying near the hearth. Younger children growing sleepy beside the warmth while adults spoke gently late into the evening. Victorian childhood also involved long encounters with death in ways modern life often hides. Funerals passed regularly through city streets. Black clothing appeared frequently after illness spread through neighborhoods. Children attended burials and memorial services from very young ages. Grief became woven into ordinary life. Yet mourning rituals themselves often carried a solemn beauty. Church bells sounding through gray skies. Candles glowing softly beside photographs. Families gathering quietly in black clothing. Rain falling gently across cemetery stones. Children learned early that life could be fragile. But they also learned how families and communities held one another through sorrow. Neighbors delivered meals. Relatives filled silent rooms with company. Hands rested gently upon shoulders without many words needing to be spoken. At night, Victorian homes settled slowly into stillness once more. Fires dimmed. Lamps were extinguished room by room. Streets outside grew quieter beneath drifting fog. Children climbed narrow staircases toward bedrooms carrying candles carefully against the darkness. In attics, the wind could often be heard moving outside the roof. In crowded tenements, voices still murmured faintly through thin walls. In country cottages, owls sometimes called beyond the fields while moonlight silvered quiet hedges. Every child entered sleep differently. Some prayed softly beside the bed. Some fell asleep instantly from exhaustion. Some stared into darkness listening to rain or distant factory sounds. And some remained awake longer than the others, thinking quietly about the world beyond their small corner of Victorian life. The world they inherited was changing rapidly. Factories expanded. Cities grew. Railways stretched farther each year. Old traditions slowly faded. But childhood itself, with all its fears, hopes, weariness, and fleeting comforts, continued quietly onward beneath the smoke-covered skies of the 19th century. As the Victorian century moved forward, the rhythm of ordinary life continued beneath layers of smoke, fog, rain, and candlelight. Children grew older quietly. Not suddenly. Not with dramatic moments. But slowly, through endless ordinary days. A pair of boots becoming too small. A coat sleeve no longer reaching the wrist. A young voice deepening slightly during winter. The small changes often passed unnoticed because families remained busy simply surviving. In industrial towns, mornings still began before sunrise for many households. Darkness lingered outside the windows while fires were lit carefully in the grate below. Coal dust settled over shelves and curtains no matter how often rooms were cleaned. The smell of smoke entered clothing so deeply it seemed almost permanent. Children learned early how to move through cold rooms without waking everyone else. Floorboards creaked softly beneath cautious feet. Water splashed quietly into metal basins. Bread crusts were divided carefully at the table. Outside, the street lamps still glowed faintly through the fog. Then the city slowly stirred awake once again. The 19th century admired productivity above almost everything else. Adults believed idleness could weaken both character and morality. Children absorbed these ideas constantly through schools, churches, workplaces, and family routines. To work hard was considered honorable. To endure discomfort quietly was considered respectable. So many children carried burdens larger than their age without complaint. A young boy delivering heavy packages through rain-soaked streets. A girl standing long hours inside a laundry room filled with steam and heat. Children working beside looms until their backs ached and their eyes burned from dust. Yet despite this, many still found moments to remain children. That may be one of the quietest truths of the Victorian age. Childhood survived anyway. In scraps. In hidden moments. In tired laughter after long days. Street games remain deeply important, especially for poor children with little access to toys or private gardens. Alleyways and narrow courtyards became places of imagination once work was finished. Hoops rolled across stones. Marbles clicked against walls. Chalk lines appeared briefly on pavement before rain washed them away. Even simple games carried warmth after difficult days. Voices echoed between brick buildings while evening light faded overhead. For a short time, exhaustion loosened its grip. Some children gathered near street musicians or puppet shows when traveling entertainers passed through poorer neighborhoods. Crowds formed quickly beneath gas lamps while music drifted through the cool evening air. A violin. A hand organ. A soft drum beat. Children stood shoulder to shoulder in patched coats listening carefully, their faces lit by flickering lantern light. These moments cost almost nothing. Yet they remained unforgettable. Victorian weather always seemed present in childhood memories. Rain especially shaped daily life across Britain. Roads became muddy. Cloaks stayed damp for days. Shoes rarely dried completely during winter. Children often sat through lessons or meals wearing clothing still wet from the journey outside. The smell of damp wool filled classrooms and kitchens alike. Umbrellas existed, but many poor families could not afford them. Children simply walked through the rain because there was no other choice. Water dripped from hair onto collars while wind pushed against small bodies crossing crowded streets. And yet rain also created strange kinds of beauty. Gas lamps glowing softly through mist. Raindrops tapping against nursery windows at bedtime. The quiet comfort of returning indoors after cold weather. A kettle beginning to boil beside the fire. Victorian evenings often carried deep emotional weight because families finally gathered together after long separations during the day. Fathers returned from factories. Mothers finished endless household labor. Children came home from workshops, schools, errands, or streets darkened by smoke. For a few hours, everyone existed within the same room again. Supper itself might remain simple. Stew stretched carefully to feed many mouths. Bread divided slowly at the table. Tea steaming beside weary hands. But the shared warmth mattered deeply. Children listened while adults discussed wages, illness, weather, rising food prices, or neighbors nearby. Many learned about the world simply by overhearing these evening conversations beside the fire. The flames flickered softly against tired faces. Outside, horses moved through the fog. Inside, the ordinary life of the Victorian family unfolded quietly once more. In wealthier homes, evenings carried different sounds. Piano music drifting through parlors. Pages turning beside the fire. Teacups resting gently on saucers. Children reading adventure stories beneath warm lamplight while rain pressed softly against tall windows. Middle-class families increasingly embraced ideas about domestic comfort during the Victorian age. The home became imagined as a refuge from the harsh industrial world outside. Parlors filled with books, framed photographs, carpets, and carefully arranged furniture meant to create feelings of warmth and respectability. Children in these homes often experienced greater physical comfort than working-class children. But pressure still surrounded them. Boys faced expectations of future success. Girls prepared for lives governed by strict social rules. Behavior remained closely observed. Even laughter sometimes needed moderation. Still, private tenderness existed beneath these formal structures. A mother brushing a daughter's hair before bed. A father reading aloud beside the fireplace. Siblings whispering stories beneath blankets after the lamps were extinguished. The Victorian family photograph became increasingly common during the later 19th century. Long exposure times required stillness, so children often appeared serious in portraits. Their small bodies sat rigidly beside parents in carefully arranged studios filled with painted backdrops and heavy furniture. Today those photographs can seem distant or cold. But behind every still expression existed a living child with ordinary fears and hopes. A child who once listened to rain at night. Who once carried warm bread home through winter fog. Who once felt sleepy beside the fire after an exhausting day. Photography itself changed how families remembered childhood. Images preserved faces across time in ways earlier generations rarely experienced. Mothers kept portraits carefully inside drawers or upon mantelpieces. Families carried photographs of children who died young. And many did die young. Victorian cemeteries filled steadily throughout the century. Illness remained unpredictable despite medical advances. Tuberculosis moved quietly through crowded neighborhoods. Cholera spread through contaminated water. Influenza returned with seasonal cold. Children understood sickness not as something rare, but as part of ordinary life. A classmate disappearing from school. Black clothing worn after funerals. Church bells ringing slowly through gray mornings. Adults speaking more quietly than usual beside the fire. Grief often entered homes without warning. Yet life continued around it relentlessly. Factories still opened at dawn. Markets still crowded the streets. Laundry still waited in heavy baskets. Children learned early how sorrow and routine existed side by side. Victorian hospitals gradually changed during the century, becoming cleaner and more organized in some places as medical understanding improved. Nurses moved through long wards carrying fresh linens and medicine bottles while sunlight entered through tall windows. Still, hospitals often frightened children deeply. The unfamiliar smells. The echoing corridors. The strange silence at night broken only by footsteps and distant coughing. Most children preferred recovery at home whenever possible, surrounded by familiar voices and objects. A favorite blanket. The sound of the kitchen downstairs. Rain against the same window they had always known. Comfort mattered greatly during illness. Especially for children. Education slowly expanded across the century as reformers pushed for broader schooling. More children learned reading and writing than ever before. Schoolrooms multiplied across towns and villages alike. But classrooms could still feel severe. Wooden desks stood in rows beneath cold windows. Teachers carried rulers or canes. Lessons depended heavily upon memorization and discipline. Children recited facts together in careful rhythm while chalk dust floated through pale morning light. For many poor children, school represented both opportunity and exhaustion. Some attended after long hours of labor. Others arrived hungry. Some struggled to stay awake during lessons because work had begun before dawn. And yet many cherished education deeply. Books opened worlds beyond smoke-covered streets and factory walls. Maps suggested distant places. Stories offered escape. A child reading beside weak candlelight at night might briefly forget cold weather, crowded rooms, and aching hands. Words carried them elsewhere. Victorian childhood beside the countryside moved at a gentler pace than city life, though hardship remained there too. Villages settled into rhythms shaped by harvests, weather, and church calendars. Morning mist hovered above fields while birdsong drifted softly through hedges. Children walked narrow dirt paths between farms carrying baskets or tools. Rivers moved quietly through reeds. Sheep grazed beneath changing skies. The countryside offered more silence. More darkness at night. More stars above the rooftops. A farm child lying awake beneath attic beams might hear only wind moving outside and distant owls calling across the fields. Yet rural isolation could feel heavy too. Opportunities remained limited. Poverty still pressed hard against families during poor harvests or difficult winters. Many young people eventually left villages for industrial cities searching for work. They carried memories of open fields into crowded streets filled with smoke and machinery. And often they missed the countryside deeply. The smell of grass after rain. The quiet of evening fields. The softness of river water moving past stones. As night settled again across Victorian Britain, lamps glowed gently inside thousands of homes. Smoke drifted above rooftops beneath moonlit clouds. Factory whistles finally fell silent in the distance. Children prepared for sleep once more. Candles lowered carefully. Shoes placed beside beds. Blankets pulled tightly against the cold. Some homes remained noisy with arguments, coughing, crying babies, or creaking floorboards. Others rested in near silence except for clocks ticking softly downstairs. And through every kind of home, from grand townhouses to crowded attic rooms, childhood continued its quiet passage through the long Victorian night. There were evenings in the Victorian age when the fog grew so thick that entire streets seemed to disappear into silence. Gas lamps floated like pale circles in the darkness. Horse hooves echoed somewhere unseen beyond the mist. Smoke drifted low above rooftops and settled into the folds of coats, curtains, and blankets. Children walking home during those evenings often stayed very close to adults. The city felt larger when hidden by fog. Familiar roads became uncertain. Buildings faded into shadows. Even ordinary sounds carried strangely through the damp air. A cart rattling in the distance. A church bell softened by mist. Footsteps approaching slowly on wet stone. Victorian children grew up deeply aware of weather because weather shaped comfort itself. Cold could enter every part of life. Dampness settled into beds, clothing, and walls. During long winters, some families fought constantly against frost, leaking roofs, and smoke-filled rooms that never seemed fully warm. And still the routines continued. Children rose before daylight. Mothers prepared breakfast beside weak fires. Fathers disappeared into factories or workshops. Schools opened. Markets filled. The city endured. In many homes, mornings began with the careful management of fuel. Coal was precious. Families measured warmth almost hour by hour. Fires burned low whenever adults left for work. Ashes were saved. Tiny pieces of coal were gathered and reused. Children often became experts at staying warm. Hands tucked beneath blankets. Feet resting close to the hearth. Scarves wrapped indoors during severe weather. A little warmth could feel like a great comfort after a cold day outside. Victorian bedrooms carried their own quiet atmosphere, especially at night. In wealthier homes, children sometimes slept inside carefully decorated nurseries with wallpaper, wooden toys, and soft candlelight glowing against polished furniture. But many children slept in cramped spaces where several family members shared the same room. Attics beneath sloping roofs. Small alcoves beside kitchens. Narrow beds pushed against damp walls. The sounds of breathing filled the darkness. A baby stirring softly nearby. Someone coughing in the next bed. Wind moving against loose window panes. These nighttime sounds became deeply familiar over the years. Comfort often came not from silence, but from knowing others were close. Victorian childhood involved enormous amounts of waiting quietly. Waiting while adults finished work. Waiting through long church sermons. Waiting in doctors' offices. Waiting for letters from distant family members. Waiting beside sick beds. Patience became part of ordinary life because so many things moved slowly during the 19th century. Travel. Communication. Medical recovery. Even daily chores demanded time. Bread dough had to rise slowly beside the stove. Laundry took entire days. Water needed carrying and heating. Candles burned down gradually while evenings stretched long into darkness. Children learned to sit quietly through these slow hours. Some stared into the fire imagining shapes among the flames. Some traced patterns in frost gathered along windows. Some listened carefully to adult conversations drifting through the room. A great deal of childhood passed in observation. Victorian schools often emphasized obedience more than curiosity. Children stood when teachers entered. Hands remained folded during lessons. Discipline shaped nearly every hour of the school day. The sound of chalk against blackboards echoed through crowded classrooms. Wooden desks creaked softly. Ink stained fingertips and cuffs. Outside the windows, rain often streaked the glass while smoke drifted across gray skies. Teachers expected memorization. Dates. Verses. Mathematics. Religious instruction. Some children succeeded easily within this structure. Others struggled quietly. Especially those already exhausted from work or hunger. A child who had spent dawn delivering coal or laboring in a workshop might find it difficult to concentrate on arithmetic during the afternoon. Eyelids grew heavy beneath the warmth of the classroom fire. Still, education slowly opened possibilities unavailable to earlier generations. Reading especially transformed childhood. Books became companions during lonely evenings. Stories traveled far beyond crowded streets and factory walls. A child reading by candlelight might visit distant forests, oceans, castles, or villages entirely through imagination. and imagination mattered greatly in Victorian life. Not because life was always joyful, but because imagination offered rest. The Victorian period also brought growing industries centered around childhood itself. Toy shops appeared in larger cities. Publishers printed more children's books. Clothing manufacturers created fashions specifically for young people. These changes reflected shifting ideas about what childhood should be. Some families increasingly viewed children as emotionally precious rather than simply useful workers. Yet these gentler ideas often belonged mainly to the middle and upper classes at first. For poor families, survival still came before sentiment. A child unable to work could place enormous strain upon household finances. So children continued laboring in factories, fields, mines, workshops, and streets long after society began romanticizing innocence. This contradiction lived quietly inside the Victorian age. Warm nursery stories beside cold factory floors. Beautiful paintings of happy children beside crowded slums only streets away. The century dreamed about childhood even while many real children remained exhausted. In mining regions, childhood carried especially harsh conditions. Coal mining towns spread across parts of Britain where black dust coated roads, homes, and clothing. Men disappeared underground before sunrise. Sometimes boys worked there too, opening ventilation doors or pulling heavy carts through narrow tunnels. Above ground, mining families lived beneath landscapes darkened by industry. The smell of coal lingered constantly. Wash water turned gray quickly. Even snow appeared stained near the pits. Children in these communities understood danger very early. Mining accidents, injuries, and lung illness shaped ordinary conversation. Women waited anxiously for the end of shifts while smoke drifted upward into cold skies. Yet life still contained small ordinary pleasures. A warm meal after work. A child laughing beside the fire. Music drifting softly from a nearby house during Saturday evening. Human tenderness survived even in the shadow of heavy industry. Victorian mothers often carried exhaustion quietly beneath endless responsibilities. Many gave birth repeatedly while managing homes without modern conveniences. Infant care, cooking, cleaning, laundry, sewing, shopping, and emotional support all rested heavily upon them. Children noticed this exhaustion. A mother sitting silently beside the fire after everyone else slept. Hands roughened by years of labor. Eyes tired beneath candlelight. Yet mothers still brushed hair gently before school. Still kissed foreheads during illness. Still stayed awake through the night beside coughing children. Victorian affection often appeared through actions rather than words. Care itself became the language of love. Fathers, too, faced enormous physical strain. Industrial labor damaged bodies gradually. Long hours bent backs and hardened hands. Many men returned home carrying deep fatigue that settled silently over the evening meal. Some fathers remained distant because exhaustion left little energy for conversation. Others tried quietly to create moments of connection despite limited time. Walking with children on Sundays. Teaching small practical skills. Repairing toys beside the fire. Reading newspapers aloud while younger children listened nearby. These ordinary moments formed the emotional structure of many families. Sunday itself often felt unlike any other day of the week. Church bells echoed across towns and villages while streets grew calmer beneath pale morning skies. Work paused for many families. Cleaner clothing emerged from drawers and wardrobes. Shoes were polished carefully if possible. Children walked beside parents toward church buildings warmed faintly by candles and crowded bodies. The smell inside remained familiar. Damp coats. Old wood. Wax. Rain carried in from outdoors. Services could feel very long for young children. They sat quietly beneath stained glass windows listening to sermons while daylight shifted slowly across the pews. Yet Sundays also brought rest. A slower afternoon meal. A family walk. Perhaps an hour beside the fire before darkness returned. For children whose lives centered around labor and routine, these pauses mattered deeply. Victorian illness often spread most rapidly during colder months. Coughing echoed through classrooms and crowded homes alike. Medicine bottles appeared beside beds. Steam rose from bowls of hot water placed near sick children struggling to breathe comfortably. Some illnesses lasted weeks. Entire households adjusted around recovery. Rooms darkened to allow rest. Voices lowered. Footsteps softened. Outside, ordinary life continued beneath winter rain and drifting fog while families waited quietly for improvement. Sometimes recovery came slowly. Sometimes not at all. And because death remained more visible in Victorian life than today, children developed an early awareness of mortality. Cemeteries stood near churches in nearly every community. Funeral processions passed regularly through the streets. Black clothing. Silent carriages. Flowers carried carefully through gray weather. These scenes became familiar parts of childhood memory. Yet life itself continued stubbornly onward through grief. Bread still baked in the ovens. Laundry still dried beside the fire. Children still played in alleyways after school. The world did not pause for sorrow, though sorrow quietly shaped many families forever. As another evening settled across Britain, fog drifted once more through the narrow streets. Lamps glowed softly behind curtains. Horses moved slowly homeward through wet roads shining beneath gaslight. Inside countless homes, children prepared for sleep. A mother folded clothing near the fire. A father removed heavy work boots beside the door. Candles flickered gently while shadows moved along the walls. Outside, the industrial century continued turning forward. But inside those small rooms, beneath blankets warmed by tired bodies and dim firelight, Victorian childhood rested quietly for another night. As the years passed deeper into the Victorian century, childhood continued to exist in the spaces between labor and rest, between discipline and tenderness, between the noise of industry and the quiet of home. The cities kept growing. Brick by brick. Street by street. Railways stretched farther across the countryside while factory chimneys multiplied beside rivers and canals. Smoke became part of the sky itself in many industrial towns. Some children grew up believing that gray air and darkened buildings were simply the natural appearance of the world. And yet even in those crowded places, there were mornings of soft beauty. Very early mornings. Before the machinery fully awakened. Before the market carts filled the roads. A pale sunrise touching wet rooftops. Fog drifting gently above silent streets. Birdsong barely audible beneath the distant hum of the city. Children who woke early enough sometimes witnessed these quiet moments while carrying milk, coal, or bread through nearly empty roads. The city felt calmer then. Almost peaceful. For a few brief minutes, Victorian life seemed to breathe slowly. Then the whistle sounded again. And another day began. Children learned the rhythm of footsteps before they understood the rhythm of history. A father's heavy boots returning after dark. The lighter quick steps of a mother moving through the kitchen before dawn. Teachers pacing between rows of desks. Factory overseers walking beside machinery. Every household carried its own familiar sounds. In crowded working-class homes, mornings often began with coughing. Coal smoke, dampness, and illness affected entire neighborhoods during the 19th century. Small rooms trapped stale air during winter. Windows remained closed against cold weather even when ventilation was badly needed. A child lying awake before sunrise might hear coughing from several nearby rooms before anyone even rose from bed. Then the fire would be lit. A kettle placed carefully above the flame. Someone opening the door briefly to the cold gray morning outside. The ordinary sounds of survival beginning once more. Victorian children often became familiar with responsibility before they became familiar with leisure. Many cared for younger siblings daily. Older sisters especially carried enormous burdens inside poor families. A girl barely into adolescence might spend her days cooking simple meals, rocking babies to sleep, washing clothing, cleaning floors, and carrying water while adults worked elsewhere. Her childhood passed quietly beneath responsibility. Yet even during labor, small private thoughts still drifted through the mind. Watching rain move slowly down the windows. Listening to church bells across the rooftops. Imagining distant places described in books or newspapers. The inner lives of Victorian children rarely appeared in official records. But they existed deeply. Many children spent long periods alone. Parents worked exhausting hours. Streets could feel dangerous. Schools ended early for those who needed employment. Solitude became common, especially in urban neighborhoods where adults remained busy simply keeping households alive. A child might sit beside the fire for an hour without speaking, listening only to crackling coal and distant street noise. Such silence was ordinary then. Not uncomfortable. Just part of life. Victorian candlelight shaped memory in quiet ways too. Evenings unfolded differently before electric lighting spread widely. Rooms glowed softly rather than brightly. Corners disappeared into shadow. Faces seemed gentler beside flickering flames. Children completed homework beside candles that sputtered during drafts. Mothers sewed late into the night under weak yellow light. Stories were read aloud while shadows trembled softly against wallpaper and ceilings. The darkness beyond the fire always felt close. And perhaps that closeness made homes feel more intimate. A family gathered around a single lamp naturally sat near one another. Voices lowered instinctively during late hours. Outside, entire streets disappeared into darkness after midnight except for scattered gaslights glowing through fog. Victorian winters especially encouraged closeness indoors. Cold rain pressed against windows while wind rattled loose shutters through the night. Children wrapped blankets tightly around themselves beside the fire. Wet socks dried slowly near the hearth. Simple warmth became a kind of luxury. A hot potato held in cold hands. Steam rising from tea. A cat sleeping beside the stove. These ordinary comforts mattered enormously. In wealthier homes, nurseries sometimes became worlds entirely their own. Toys rested neatly on shelves beside storybooks and dolls. Wallpaper displayed flowers, animals, or painted scenes from distant lands. Nurses moved quietly through warm rooms carrying candles and folded blankets. Children there often experienced gentler physical surroundings than poor children. But loneliness could still exist even within comfort. A boy at boarding school missing home during winter term. A girl sitting quietly through endless etiquette lessons. Children instructed always to behave properly, speak correctly, sit correctly. Victorian respectability often demanded emotional restraint. Even affection followed rules. Some children longed for freedom they could barely describe. To run through fields. To shout loudly. To dirty their clothes without punishment. Meanwhile, poor children often possessed more freedom outdoors, though far less safety or security. Streets became their playgrounds because there were few other places available. They wandered markets, riverbanks, alleys, vacant lots, and narrow courtyards beneath hanging laundry and drifting smoke. The city itself raised them in many ways. They learned caution quickly. Which strangers to avoid? Which streets flooded during storms? Where warmth could be found during winter evenings? Where bread might be available cheaply before closing time? Knowledge became survival. Victorian childhood beside rivers carried a softer rhythm than factory districts. Along canals and waterways, life slowed slightly. Barges drifted quietly beneath bridges while water reflected pale skies and rows of brick warehouses. Children often lingered near the water whenever possible. Skipping stones. Watching boats. Listening to gulls overhead. Even polluted rivers held strange beauty at certain hours, especially early morning when mist hovered above the surface and sunlight touched the water gently through the smoke. A child sitting alone beside the river after work might feel temporary peace there. The movement of water soothed something difficult to name. Victorian illness often interrupted childhood suddenly. Scarlet fever, measles, diphtheria, influenza, and tuberculosis spread quickly through crowded neighborhoods. Schools emptied during outbreaks. Curtains remained drawn in sick rooms where children rested beneath quilts while medicine bottles lined nearby tables. Mothers checked foreheads constantly. Doctors arrived carrying leather bags through rain-soaked streets. Neighbors whispered updates quietly beside market stalls and church doors. A sick child's world became very small. The bed. The window. The sound of footsteps downstairs. The soft glow of candlelight during long nights. Recovery could feel endless. Yet many children remembered certain comforts from illness vividly. Cool cloths placed gently on the forehead. Broth carried carefully upstairs. A parent remaining awake nearby through the darkness. Victorian fathers often struggled to express tenderness openly because society expected emotional hardness from men. But care still appeared in quiet ways. A father fixing a broken toy after work despite exhaustion. Saving coins for a child's winter boots. Walking slowly beside a sick child on rare free afternoons. Actions spoke where words remained difficult. Children understood this more than adults sometimes realized. The Victorian school day itself could feel very long. Bells marked lessons with strict precision. Students copied lines repeatedly onto slates while teachers supervised large crowded classrooms. Outside the windows, seasons changed slowly throughout the year. Rain streaked the glass during autumn. Frost gathered in winter corners. Spring sunlight drifted softly across wooden desks. Summer heat made the rooms heavy and difficult to endure. Children watched these seasonal changes closely because outdoor life often mattered more than classroom routine. The sound of rain might distract an entire room. Snowfall transformed ordinary streets into something magical for a few brief hours. Even factory children sometimes paused to watch snow falling beyond dirty windows. Nature still reached them. Even through smoke. Victorian bedtime routines varied enormously between rich and poor, but certain quiet details remained universal. Candles lowered carefully. Shoes placed beside the bed. Voices softening as night deepened. A child listening to the sounds of the house settling into darkness. Floorboards creaked differently after midnight. Wind seemed louder once conversation stopped. Distant church bells echoed more clearly through the sleeping city. Some children feared the dark deeply. Others found comfort in it. Night offered rest from expectation. No lessons. No labor. No errands. Only blankets, breathing, and dreams. And dreams mattered greatly in Victorian childhood. Dreams of warmer homes. Dreams of distant oceans and quiet forests. Dreams shaped by storybooks, sermons, songs, and imagination. Even the poorest children carried inner worlds untouched by factory whistles and crowded streets. As another day faded across Britain, evening fog drifted once more between the gas lamps. Shopkeepers closed shutters against the cold. Horses pulled the final carts through wet streets shining faintly beneath the moon. Inside homes, fires burned lower. Children yawned beside the warmth. Mothers folded laundry. Fathers rested silently after long labor. And slowly, beneath smoke-darkened ceilings and quiet Victorian skies, another generation of childhood disappeared gently into sleep. There were certain sounds that belonged only to Victorian nights. The distant rolling of carriage wheels over wet stone. The soft hiss of gas lamps burning in the fog. Wind slipping beneath doors and rattling loose window frames. And somewhere far away, beyond rows of sleeping houses, the low steady hum of factories that never seemed to rest completely. Children lying awake in bed often listened closely to these sounds. Night sharpened hearing. In darkness, every small noise felt larger. A kettle settling in the kitchen below. Footsteps crossing the upstairs hallway. Rain beginning softly against the roof. The breathing of brothers and sisters asleep nearby. For many Victorian children, bedtime was the only hour when life finally became still enough for quiet thoughts. During the day, survival left little room for reflection. There was always work waiting. Water to carry. Floors to clean. Lessons to memorize. Machines to tend. Errands to run through crowded streets. But at night, beneath blankets warmed slowly by tired bodies, the mind drifted elsewhere. Toward memory. Toward imagination. Toward dreams. The Victorian age often expected children to become useful quickly. A child was rarely treated as separate from the practical needs of family life. Even affection frequently carried instruction within it. Be good. Be respectful. Work hard. Stay quiet. Obey. These lessons repeated gently and constantly through homes, churches, schools, and workplaces alike. Yet children remained children despite every expectation placed upon them. A boy delivering newspapers through freezing rain might still stop briefly to watch birds circling above the rooftops. A young servant girl scrubbing floors might quietly hum songs remembered from home. A factory child staring through dusty windows might imagine distant green fields untouched by smoke. Imagination survived because it had to. Victorian kitchens after sunset often became the warmest places in the house. Fires glowed softly beneath blackened kettles while steam clouded the windows against the cold outside. The smell of onions, broth, bread, or tea settled into the room like comfort itself. Children gathered close to the hearth during winter evenings. Hands stretched toward warmth. Wet shoes drying nearby. Faces glowing orange beneath flickering firelight. Sometimes conversation remained lively. Sometimes exhaustion filled the room with silence. But even silence could feel peaceful when shared beside warmth. Many mothers worked late into the night long after children became sleepy. Sewing was nearly endless in large families. Torn sleeves needed mending. Buttons needed replacing. Blankets required patching before winter deepened. The sound of a needle moving through fabric became part of nighttime memory for many Victorian children. Soft. Steady. Almost soothing. A child drifting toward sleep might hear that sound while rain tapped gently outside the windows. Victorian fathers often returned home carrying the physical weight of labor upon their bodies. Coal dust darkened faces and cuffs. Factory heat lingered in clothing. Muscles stiffened after endless hours standing, lifting, digging, or pulling. Many men sat quietly after supper simply because they were too tired for speech. Children learned to recognize these silences. Not angry silences. Just weary ones. A father warming his hands near the fire after work. Boots drying beside the door. Eyes half closed while listening to the household around him. And still, within exhaustion, tenderness remained possible. A rough hand smoothing a child's hair briefly before bedtime. A quiet story shared beside the fire. A tired smile after a long day. Victorian weather shaped emotions as much as routines. Long stretches of gray skies and rain created a certain heaviness across towns and cities. Fog dimmed daylight. Winter darkness arrived early. Cold settled deeply into old buildings. Children became sensitive to small changes in weather. A rare bright morning after weeks of rain could transform the mood of an entire street. Windows opened slightly. Laundry appeared outdoors. Voices sounded lighter. Sunlight itself felt precious. In the countryside, weather mattered even more directly. Farm children watched the skies constantly because crops, animals, and income depended upon changing conditions. Heavy rain threatened harvests. Frost damaged fields. Strong winds shook small cottages through the night. A child growing up in rural Victorian England understood nature not as scenery, but as something powerful and deeply connected to survival. Morning mist over fields. The smell of wet hay. Birdsong drifting through hedges at dawn. These became part of ordinary childhood memory. Rural nights often felt darker and quieter than city nights. Without gas lamps or crowded streets, villages settled into deep stillness after sunset. Candlelight glowed softly behind cottage windows while owls called beyond the fields. Children sleeping beneath sloped attic roofs might hear only wind moving outside and the distant barking of dogs far away. The silence itself could feel enormous. Yet comforting too. Victorian childhood also carried strong awareness of class boundaries. Even very young children noticed differences in clothing, speech, food, and opportunity. A wealthy child passing through poor districts in a carriage might glimpse barefoot children standing beside smoky alleyways. A poor child delivering parcels to elegant homes might stare silently at carpets, chandeliers, and rooms large enough to feel almost unreal. The contrast shaped understanding early. Some children grew up expecting comfort and education. Others grew up expecting labor. And many accepted these divisions simply because they had never known another world. Still, moments of shared humanity crossed these boundaries quietly. A schoolteacher offering kindness to a hungry student. A wealthy woman distributing blankets during winter. Children playing together briefly in parks before adults separated them once more according to class and custom. Victorian society remained deeply structured, yet ordinary compassion still appeared everywhere in small unnoticed acts. Street life after dark carried a different atmosphere entirely. Markets closed gradually while vendors packed unsold goods beneath weak lantern light. Public houses filled with tired workers escaping cold streets for warmth and conversation. Children sometimes waited outside these buildings for fathers finishing long evenings inside. Fog drifted low around their boots while gas lamps reflected in puddles along the road. The city at night could feel lonely for children. Yet also strangely beautiful. Light glowing through misted windows. Snow falling silently across rooftops. Church clocks echoing across empty streets after midnight. Some children worked during the night as well. Newspaper printing houses, bakeries, transport yards, and markets required labor before dawn. Young workers moved through sleeping streets carrying baskets, tools, or bundles beneath the pale moonlight. The Victorian city never fully slept, only changed rhythm. Even hospitals carried their own nighttime atmosphere. Long wards rested beneath dim lamps while nurses moved quietly between beds. Sick children listened to footsteps echoing through corridors, smelling faintly of medicine, soap, and coal smoke. Outside the windows, rain often blurred the glass while distant carriage wheels rolled slowly through darkness. Illness made children notice time differently. Hours stretched long beside candlelight. The smallest comfort became meaningful. A cool cloth. A whispered voice. The first warm sunlight after fever finally broke. Victorian Christmases remained especially vivid in childhood memory. During the later 19th century, holiday traditions grew stronger across many families. Candles glowed against evergreen branches while simple decorations brightened dark winter rooms. Even poor households tried to create moments of celebration. Special bread. A little meat if affordable. Small handmade gifts. Children waited eagerly for these brief interruptions to ordinary hardship. Snow outside made everything quieter. Footsteps softened beneath white streets. Smoke rose gently above rooftops. Families gathered close together against the cold. For a few evenings each year, warmth and light seemed to hold back the darkness a little longer. Victorian bedtime prayers also formed part of many childhood routines. Kneeling beside beds. Folded hands. Soft voices speaking familiar words into candlelit rooms. Religion shaped emotional life deeply during the century. Children learned about morality, suffering, kindness, obedience, heaven, and death from very early ages. Churches stood at the center of many communities both physically and spiritually. Bell towers marked time itself. Sunday hymns drifted through cold morning air. Funerals and baptisms gathered entire neighborhoods together. Faith often offered comfort during hardship, especially for children facing uncertainty or grief. And grief remained common enough that many children carried memories of loss throughout their lives. A sibling gone too soon. A parent weakened by illness. An empty chair beside the fire. Victorian mourning rituals allowed sorrow to become visible through black clothing, quiet voices, covered mirrors, and long periods of remembrance. Children absorbed these rituals naturally because death existed close beside ordinary life. Yet even through mourning, childhood continued. Lessons resumed. Laundry dried beside the fire. Games returned slowly to the streets. The human heart learned how to carry sadness alongside routine. As another late evening settled across Victorian Britain, homes dimmed gradually one by one beneath drifting smoke and low clouds. Candles shortened. Fires faded into glowing embers. Children closed heavy eyes after another long day shaped by work, weather, discipline, family, and fleeting moments of comfort. And outside, beneath fog-covered skies and silent church towers, the vast sleeping world of Victorian childhood drifted quietly onward through the night. By the later decades of the Victorian age, many adults had begun speaking about childhood with increasing softness. Writers described innocence. Teachers discussed education reforms. Charities opened homes for poor children. Doctors slowly studied childhood illness with greater care. Yet despite these changing ideas, everyday life for ordinary children still moved according to work, weather, family duty, and survival. The great industrial cities continued breathing smoke into the sky. Factories still called workers before dawn. Coal fires still darkened ceilings and curtains. And children still grew tired very young. In narrow London streets, mornings arrived quietly at first. Fog pressed against rooftops while lamps glowed faintly through the pale darkness. Somewhere nearby, a bakery oven already burned hot before sunrise. The smell of bread drifted softly through alleyways lined with damp brick. Children waking in those streets often remained still for a few moments before rising. Blankets held warmth. The room beyond the bed did not. Outside, cartwheels rolled slowly across wet stones. A church bell sounded somewhere far away. Then the day began again. Victorian childhood carried endless repetition, but within that repetition existed thousands of tiny unnoticed moments. A younger brother falling asleep at the table during supper. Steam rising from wet coats drying beside the fire. The comfort of hearing rain while safely indoors. A teacher pausing beside a student's desk to offer unexpected kindness. History often forgets these moments because they leave behind so little evidence. No monuments. No speeches. No official records. Only quiet human memory. And yet these small experiences formed the true shape of childhood far more than grand historical events. In working-class neighborhoods, many children spent surprisingly little time entirely alone. Crowded homes and busy streets meant constant closeness with others. Privacy barely existed. Children shared beds. Shared meals. Shared illness. Shared grief. Shared warmth during winter. This closeness could sometimes feel overwhelming, but it also created deep familiarity. Siblings understood one another without many words. Families recognized footsteps on staircases. Mothers could identify children simply from the sound of coughing in the next room. A child returning home after dark might feel immediate comfort upon hearing familiar voices through the door before entering. The warmth of belonging mattered greatly in a difficult world. Victorian servants often experienced childhood fading into adulthood almost without transition. Young girls entered domestic service while still very young, sometimes leaving home permanently in their early teens. Large houses looked beautiful from the outside. Inside, servant life remained exhausting. Boots polished before sunrise. Floors scrubbed on aching knees. Coal carried upstairs. Laundry steamed through long afternoons. Servants moved constantly through hallways while trying not to be noticed. And many were still children themselves. A young maid might stand alone beside a kitchen fire late at night after everyone else had gone to sleep, rubbing tired hands together while waiting for water to boil. Outside the windows, snow drifted slowly beneath the gas lamps. Perhaps she thought about home then. About fields far away. About younger siblings. About childhood already slipping quietly behind her. Victorian boys also entered adult responsibilities early. Apprenticeships placed them inside workshops where trades were learned through long hours and strict supervision. Blacksmith shops glowed orange with heat. Carpentry rooms smelled of fresh wood and dust. Printing houses echoed with machinery and ink-stained labor. Children learned through repetition. Again and again. Hands toughened slowly. Voices deepened. The body adapted to labor long before the mind fully understood adulthood. Yet even among apprentices and workers, play survived whenever possible. A football kick through muddy streets after work. Laughter outside factories at day's end. Small jokes shared quietly during lessons or labor. Children remained capable of joy even inside difficult circumstances. Victorian summers brought temporary changes to city life. Windows opened wider despite smoke and noise. Children stayed outdoors longer during warm evenings while sunset lingered across rooftops and chimneys. The streets carried different smells in summer. Dust. Horse manure drying in heat. River water warmed by sunlight. Fresh vegetables arriving in crowded markets. Children often played until darkness finally settled, reluctant to return indoors after long cold months. Some families visited parks or commons on rare free afternoons. Blankets spread beneath trees. Bread and tea carried carefully from home. Babies sleeping in the shade while older children wandered beside ponds or grassy fields. For a few hours, the city seemed far away. Victorian parks became places where children could briefly experience open space rarely available in crowded neighborhoods. Grass beneath bare feet. Wind moving freely through trees. Clouds drifting slowly overhead without factory roofs blocking the sky. These simple sensations felt almost luxurious for many poor children. Nature itself became a form of rest. In coastal towns, summer brought visitors arriving from inland cities seeking sea air and relief from industrial smoke. Children living there watched strangers walking beside the shore beneath parasols and wide hats. Fishing boats rocked gently against the docks. Gulls cried overhead. Salt wind carried coolness through narrow streets. For local children, the sea remained both beautiful and dangerous. Fathers and brothers disappeared onto uncertain waters before dawn. Storms brought fear to entire communities waiting beside dark windows late into the night. Yet calm evenings beside the harbor could feel deeply peaceful. Lantern light reflecting softly on black water. Ropes creaking against wooden posts. Children growing sleepy while listening to distant waves. Victorian autumns carried particular melancholy. Leaves gathered wet against curbstones while smoke thickened again above the cities. School terms resumed. Evenings darkened earlier each week. Children walked home beneath fading skies carrying books, tools, baskets, or simply exhaustion from another long day. The air smelled of rain and coal fires beginning once more. Inside homes, preparations for winter quietly resumed. Blankets repaired. Clothing patched. Coal supplies counted carefully. Adults worried about money more visibly during colder months. Children noticed these worries even when nothing was spoken aloud. A mother hesitating before purchasing food at market. A father studying bills silently beside the fire. Voices lowered after children supposedly went to sleep. Victorian children often understood more than adults realized. The emotional atmosphere of a home could be felt without explanation. Warmth. Tension. Fear. Relief. These moods shaped memory as deeply as physical surroundings. School friendships also became important parts of childhood during the 19th century. Even strict classrooms allowed quiet companionship to grow between students. Shared lunches. Whispered conversations. Walking home together through rain-soaked streets. A lonely child might remember one small kindness from a classmate for years afterward. A pencil shared. A seat saved near the fire. Someone waiting after lessons before walking home through the fog together. Friendship often appeared through tiny gestures rather than dramatic declarations. Victorian children learned early how precious gentleness could be. In wealthier homes, music frequently shaped evening life. Pianos stood in parlors beneath framed photographs and heavy curtains. Girls practiced scales and hymns while adults listened nearby. Music drifted softly through candlelit rooms during rainy evenings. Sometimes children secretly loved these lessons. Sometimes they dreaded them. Yet many later remembered the sound itself with great tenderness. Notes floating through warm rooms while darkness gathered outside the windows. Poorer families experienced music differently. Songs came from street performers, taverns nearby, church choirs, or voices within the home itself. Mothers sang lullabies while rocking infants near the fire. Workers hummed familiar tunes after supper. Music required no wealth to comfort people. Only a voice. Only memory. Victorian hospitals and orphanages slowly changed as reformers pushed for cleaner conditions and greater care for children. Some institutions became gentler over time. Others remained harsh and overcrowded. Children living within institutions often developed deep attachments to small routines. A favorite corner near a window. The smell of soup from the kitchen. A nurse who spoke kindly. Routine provided stability when family life had been lost or broken. And stability mattered greatly in childhood. As electric lighting slowly began appearing toward the very end of the Victorian era, certain city streets changed at night. Brightness spread farther into darkness than candlelight or gas lamps ever could. But many homes remained dim and quiet as they had always been. Fires crackled softly. Candles flickered beside beds. Children drifted into sleep listening to familiar nighttime sounds. The century changed around them. Yet the ordinary emotional world of childhood remained remarkably constant. The longing for warmth. The fear of loneliness. The comfort of gentle voices nearby. The quiet hope that tomorrow might feel a little easier than today. And so another Victorian evening faded slowly into darkness. Fog moved once more across the rooftops. Church bells echoed faintly through cold air. Parents lowered lamps and covered the fire for the night. And beneath blankets tucked carefully around tired bodies, countless children disappeared softly into dreams beneath the long fading century. The night has grown very quiet now. Across the old Victorian streets, the final lamps burn softly behind curtains and fog. The factories have fallen silent for a few short hours. The markets are empty. Rainwater rests quietly in the dark cobblestones while chimney smoke drifts slowly into the sleeping sky. Inside the small homes and narrow attic rooms of the 19th century, children sleep beneath heavy blankets worn smooth by years of use. Some dream beside fading fires. Some rest near windows touched gently by moonlight. Some sleep close beside brothers and sisters while wind moves softly outside the roof. And somewhere far away in the countryside, beyond the smoke of the cities, quiet fields lie silver beneath the night. Rivers move slowly through the darkness. Trees stand still in the cold air. A distant owl calls once, then disappears again into silence. The long Victorian day is finally over. The boots have been removed beside the door. The sewing has been folded away. The candles have burned low. Parents sit quietly for a few final moments before sleep while the house settles around them with soft creaks and fading warmth. And the forgotten children of that old century, so often hidden beneath the larger stories of industry, empire, and history, drift gently into rest at last. Their small lives continue softly in the darkness. The sound of rain against windows. The warmth of bread beside the fire. The tired comfort of family gathered close during winter cold. The quiet dreams carried through smoky streets and candlelit rooms. And slowly now, the fog deepens over the sleeping rooftops of Victorian England. The church bells are still. The rivers move quietly through the dark. The last embers fade into soft orange light. And history itself grows calm and distant beneath the peaceful night.